There was a moment in early 1944 when the air war over Europe quietly shifted. No announcement was made, no new aircraft rolled out of a secret hangar. Yet pilots began reporting something they couldn't explain. American fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, were suddenly faster, climbing harder, and chasing down targets that had always managed to slip away. At first, these stories sounded like exaggerations caused by stress or adrenaline. But something real had happened, and it came from an unexpected place: a purple liquid poured into fuel tanks. It wasn't a new engine, it wasn't a hidden weapon system. It was a fuel so potent that it changed the physics inside every cylinder of a Mustang's Merlin engine. And for the German pilots who depended on their aircraft's speed to survive, this invisible upgrade was about to become a nightmare. The truth didn't begin on a battlefield, but on a quiet test range in Dayton, Ohio. A test pilot in a P-51 eased the throttle forward, watching the boost pressure climb higher than any engineer intended. As the gauge passed 75 inches of mercury, the Mustang surged ahead, slicing through cold air with a force that startled even the ground crew listening through static-filled radios. At 25,000 feet, the airspeed indicator pushed beyond 448 miles per hour, well above the Mustang's known limits. The engineers didn't cheer, they stared. Because this wasn't a small improvement, it was a leap. And the only thing that had changed was the fuel. Grade 150, dyed purple. Fresh, experimental, and beyond anything Germany could match. At the same moment, German fighters Bf-109 gigaseconds and Fw-190s were capped around 400 to 408 miles per hour. For years, German pilots relied on speed to dictate the fight. A quick dive, a burst of cannon fire, and an escape into the clouds. But the new Mustangs were about to erase that tactic entirely. The root of this advantage went back long before the war. American petroleum engineers had spent decades refining the science behind detonation resistance. They understood that higher octane numbers allowed engines to run at far greater compression, generating more power without tearing themselves apart. Germany focused on synthetic fuel, converting coal into aviation gasoline, an impressive achievement, but one that capped their performance. Rumors inside Allied laboratories suggested something remarkable. Fuel could be engineered to take far more punishment than regular gasoline. British scientists had already pushed the envelope with 100-octane fuel during the Battle of Britain, giving Spitfires a crucial speed boost just when they needed it most. But the next breakthrough, 150-grade fuel, was in another league entirely. This new fuel wasn't truly 150 octane. Chemically, that wasn't possible. Instead, it achieved what researchers called a performance number of 150, meaning it could handle 50% more compression than pure iso-octane. It was the difference between an engine running safely and an engine detonating itself into scrap metal. The fuel arrived at the front quietly. There were no special markings except the purple dye, added so no mechanic accidentally mixed it with standard 130 grade. Only select units in the 8th Air Force received it at first, partly to test it in combat and partly because supply was limited, but the results were impossible to ignore. Pilots returned from sorties with reports of chasing down German fighters at speeds they'd never reached before. Some claimed they closed the distance so fast it felt like something was pulling them forward. Others described the engine's power as if a hidden gear had been unlocked. And while their stories sounded unbelievable, the data backed them up. The Mustang was no longer just a long-range escort, it was an interceptor, a hunter. A machine that controlled the fight instead of reacting to it. But the true shock came once the V-1 flying bombs appeared over Britain. These weapons screamed across the sky at roughly 400 miles per hour, fast enough that intercepting them required perfect timing and superior speed. With standard fuel, fighters struggled, but Mustangs burning the new blend could close the gap with room to spare. They weren't just shooting V-1 south down. They were performing dangerous wing-tipping maneuvers, nudging the bombs off course at the very edge of control. Inside the Luftwaffe, confusion spread. Reports poured in describing American fighters with acceleration beyond expected limits. Some pilots insisted the Mustangs were running experimental superchargers. Others thought the Americans had secretly redesigned the Merlin engine. A few believed entirely new aircraft models were being tested under cover of older ones. The notion that the difference came from gasoline sounded absurd. Commanders dismissed the reports as exaggeration. They blamed stress, fatigue, faulty instruments, anything except the possibility that Allied fuel had surpassed theirs so completely. This refusal to accept what was happening cost them time they didn't have. Meanwhile, German aviation was breaking down from within. Their synthetic fuel plants were targeted relentlessly. Storage tanks burned, pipelines ruptured. Even when fuel reached airfields, it arrived in quantities too small for proper training. New pilots were thrown into combat with only a fraction of the hours American pilots logged before their first mission, and the Mustangs kept getting faster. Inside the Merlin engine, the 150-grade fuel enabled boost levels that would have destroyed engines using regular gasoline. But the chemistry kept everything stable: higher temperatures, higher pressure, higher power without detonation. The trade-off was increased lead deposits and heavy maintenance demands. But ground crews adapted quickly, swapping spark plugs more often, adjusting inspection intervals, and accepting the workload because the performance gains were impossible to ignore. Combat reports from the summer of 1944 show a clear shift. German fighters that once escaped at high altitude were now caught easily. Mustangs returned with strings of victories, not because pilots had changed, but because the fuel unlocked a new tier of capability. In several accounts recorded after the war, Luftwaffe aces described their shock at being run down by Mustangs in situations where they had always expected to get away. One pilot later recalled facing a Mustang that accelerated so quickly, he thought the American had engaged some kind of emergency power system unavailable to German fighters. Another insisted the Allied aircraft must have been modified because its climb rate seemed unnatural. But what they were experiencing wasn't a mechanical upgrade, it was chemical. By late 1944, German commanders realized something was wrong, but it was too late. Units were grounded for lack of fuel. Those that flew often had enough for only a single sortie. Engagements were brief, desperate, and one-sided. The Luftwaffe had pilots with experience, but not enough fuel to train replacements. Every loss meant another irreplaceable gap. And while Germany struggled to keep its fighters airborne, the Allies filled the sky with Mustangs burning a fuel Germany simply couldn't match. The industrial divide became undeniable. Allied refineries produced fuel by the millions of gallons, shipped across oceans, and distributed to dozens of airfields. German synthetic plants produced a fraction of that, and the Allied bombing campaign slowly crushed even that limited capacity. From January to May 1944, American bombers suffered painful losses. But after the Mustang switched to 150-grade fuel, the air war transformed. Loss rates dropped, fighter victory soared. By early 1945, American formations crossed into German airspace with almost complete impunity. Fighters roamed freely, striking targets at will, while German aircraft struggled to take off, much less challenge them. When the air war ended, analysts traced the causes of Allied dominance: better training, better logistics, overwhelming numbers, and brilliant aircraft design. But hidden among those reasons was something far easier to overlook: the fuel that made every Mustang a little faster, a little stronger, and far more dangerous than any German pilot expected. The purple liquid didn't just power aircraft. It powered strategy, it powered confidence. It powered the relentless pressure that ultimately collapsed the Luftwaffe. Even advanced jets like the Me-162, impressive on paper, couldn't change the outcome. They arrived too late, with too little fuel, and not nearly enough trained pilots to fly them effectively. In the end, the most important weapon wasn't always the one with wings or guns. Sometimes, it was something far simpler: a formula perfected in a lab, refined in a factory, and poured quietly into the fuel tanks of fighters that would go on to dominate the sky. The P-51 Mustang didn't need a redesign to become one of the most feared aircraft of the war. It only needed the right fuel, and once it had it, Germany's hope of controlling the air vanished. Because speed decides survival, speed decides strategy, and speed decides the future. Grade 150 fuel gave the Mustang all three. And that transformation, hidden, chemical, and nearly invisible, became one of the most powerful turning points in the battle for Europe's skies.